Late 1944. Japan. By this stage of the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy is no longer fighting for dominance. It is fighting for survival. Aircraft carriers have been lost faster than they can be replaced. Experienced pilots are gone. Fuel is scarce. And American industrial output has transformed the Pacific into a battlefield Japan can no longer control. In this moment of crisis, Japan commits to one of the most extraordinary naval projects in history. Her name is Shinano. Originally laid down as the third battleship of the Yamato class, Shinano was designed to be one of the most powerful surface combatants ever built. Her hull alone displaced more than 70,000 tons. Her armor was intended to withstand battleship gunfire. She was conceived as a symbol of overwhelming force. But by 1943, that vision was already obsolete. The decisive weapon of naval warfare was no longer the battleship. It was the aircraft carrier. And Japan no longer had enough carriers to fight the war it had started. Shinano's fate was rewritten in secrecy. Still unfinished, still hidden from enemy reconnaissance, her massive hull was converted into an aircraft carrier. Not to launch airstrikes, but to support other carriers. She would carry spare aircraft, fuel, and munitions. A floating arsenal meant to sustain a fleet that was already bleeding to death. The result was a ship that should never have existed. Shinano was enormous, but incomplete. Powerful, but conceptually compromised. She carried no full air group of her own. Her internal systems were unfinished. Her crew was assembled in haste. Many compartments were not yet fully sealed. Damage control procedures had barely been practiced. Yet despite all this, she was ordered to sea. For Japan's naval command, Shinano represented hope through scale. If the war could not be won through skill or experience, perhaps it could still be endured through size, armor, and secrecy. They believed her strength lay in her mass. They were wrong. Shinano would enter the ocean not as a weapon of dominance, but as a symbol of desperation, a giant born too late for a war already lost, and she would survive only a matter of hours. Shinano was not just a warship, she was a secret. From the moment her conversion began, the Imperial Japanese Navy surrounded the project with extraordinary levels of secrecy. Workers sworn to silence, construction areas sealed, information compartmentalized so that no one, except a handful of senior officers, understood the ship's full purpose. Even many members of her future crew did not know what kind of vessel they were being assigned to. The reason was simple. Shinano represented one of Japan's last strategic gambles. If the Americans learned of her existence before she was operational, she would become a priority target, and Japan could not afford to lose another capital ship before it ever entered combat. But secrecy had a cost. Training was rushed or skipped entirely. Damage control drills were limited. Crew coordination was minimal. The shipyard focused on getting Shinano to sea as quickly as possible, not on finishing her properly. Watertight compartments were left incomplete. Pipes and valves were installed hastily. Some bulkheads were never fully tested under pressure. Civilian workers were still aboard during final preparations, sealing openings and finishing internal systems even as the ship was being readied for departure. Time was the enemy. American submarines prowled Japanese waters. Air raids intensified. Fuel shortages grew worse by the week. Naval Command feared that if Shinano remained in port too long, she would be destroyed before ever sailing. So the decision was made. Shinano would leave Yokosuka incomplete. Her maiden voyage would not be a test cruise, but a transfer. from the naval arsenal at Yokosuka to Kure, where final fitting out would supposedly be completed under safer conditions. The ship would sail at night, under escort, with minimal radio transmissions. The ocean itself would provide the final layer of concealment. It was a dangerous gamble, because secrecy does not strengthen steel, it does not seal bulkheads, and it does not replace training. By choosing speed over readiness, the Japanese Navy ensured that Shinano would face her first real test not in a controlled environment, but in combat conditions, hidden from the enemy, unfinished from within. A giant wrapped in steel and silence, sailing into a war that no longer allowed mistakes. Shinano was called an aircraft carrier, but she was never meant to fight like one. By late 1944, Japan no longer believed it could challenge American carrier forces head-on. The disasters at Midway, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf had shattered the illusion of naval parity. Carrier air groups were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Experienced pilots were gone. Fuel was scarce. Aircraft production struggled under relentless bombing. So Shinano was given a different role. She would not launch massive airstrikes. She would not duel American carriers across the Pacific. Instead, Shinano was designed as a floating support base, a carrier for carriers. Her vast internal spaces were intended to store spare aircraft, engines, ammunition, fuel, and supplies. She would act as a mobile repair facility capable of servicing damaged aircraft from other carriers and airfields. Her hangars were not optimized for rapid launch cycles, but for storage and maintenance. Many aircraft aboard Shinano would never take off from her deck at all. In theory, it was a logical adaptation to Japan's deteriorating strategic position. In practice, it created a ship with a dangerous identity crisis. Shinano carried no fully assembled air group of her own. Most of the aircraft assigned to her were disassembled, crated, or incomplete. Some were missing engines. Others lacked trained pilots. Even her flight deck operations were never properly rehearsed. She was enormous, heavily armored, but offensively toothless. Her protection reflected this defensive mindset. Shinano possessed some of the thickest armor ever installed on an aircraft carrier. Her deck armor exceeded that of many battleships. Her designers expected her to absorb punishment rather than deliver it. Yet armor alone does not win naval battles. An aircraft carrier without aircraft is not a predator. It is a target. Shinano's value existed only if she survived long enough to support other ships. If she were damaged or sunk before fulfilling that role, her immense size and cost would represent nothing but wasted steel, and she sailed into enemy-infested waters with exactly that vulnerability. No combat air patrol of her own, no offensive striking power, no proven defensive coordination. A ship built for a war Japan was already losing. Shinano embodied the final phase of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a force reacting instead of shaping events, improvising instead of commanding the seas. She was not meant to fight. She was meant to endure. But endurance requires preparation, and preparation was the one thing Shinano did not have. A warship is not steel, it is people, and aboard Shinano, those people were not ready. By November 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was hemorrhaging experienced sailors. Years of combat had taken their toll. Veteran crews had been lost with their ships at Midway, Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf. Training pipelines were collapsing. New sailors were rushed through shortened programs and sent directly into service. Shinano's crew reflected this reality. Many aboard her had never served on an aircraft carrier before. Some had never served at sea at all. Specialists were missing. Damage control teams were incomplete. Entire sections of the crew had never worked together as a unit. Even basic coordination was untested. There were no full-scale damage control drills, no realistic flooding exercises, no combat simulations. The crew knew where they were assigned, but not how they would respond when things went wrong. This was especially dangerous aboard Shinano. Her massive size created complex internal spaces, long corridors, multiple decks, vast compartments connected by pipes, cables, and ventilation shafts. A single failure could spread rapidly if not contained by disciplined, well-trained teams. But Shinano's sailors had never practiced sealing a flooding compartment under pressure. They had never rehearsed counter-flooding procedures in darkness and chaos. They had never tested their ability to communicate when power failed. Even worse, many watertight doors were unfamiliar to the crew. Some were newly installed. Others were still being adjusted by civilian workers. In an emergency, hesitation of even a few seconds could prove fatal. Command structure added another layer of vulnerability. Captain Toshio Abe was a competent officer, but he was commanding a ship unlike any he had ever known. Shinano was larger than any vessel in Japanese service. Her handling characteristics were unfamiliar. Her systems were unfinished. Her crew inexperienced. Authority existed on paper. Confidence did not. The crew believed in a ship's strength. They trusted her armor. They believed that her size made her safe. But strength without training is an illusion. When disaster comes, survival depends not on design, but on instinct, on repetition, on discipline forged under pressure. Shinano had none of these. She sailed not as a cohesive warship, but as a collection of individuals still learning their roles. Sailors who had never faced a real emergency together, men who did not yet understand the ship they lived inside. And when the ocean finally tested them, it would not allow second chances. Shinano went to sea for the first time on the night of November 28, 1944. There was no ceremony, no public announcement, no sense of triumph. Her departure from Yokosuka was quiet, almost cautious, as if the Imperial Japanese Navy itself did not fully trust what it had created. The great ship slipped into Tokyo Bay under cover of darkness, escorted by 3 destroyers, Isokaze, Yukikaze, and Hamikaze. Veteran escorts, experienced in submarine warfare, chosen to shield Japan's most secret vessel during her transit to Kure. Shinano's orders were simple. Reach Kure as quickly as possible. She was not to engage the enemy. She was not to test her systems. She was not to risk delay. Speed mattered more than readiness. Inside the ship, the atmosphere was tense. Many sailors were experiencing their first extended time at sea. Others sensed unease they could not quite explain. Machinery hummed through unfinished compartments. Temporary seals creaked under pressure as the ship pushed through open water. Civilian workers were still aboard. Some were finishing electrical installations, others sealing pipes, tightening bolts, or testing valves that had never been stressed under real sea conditions. In several compartments, waterproofing had been rushed or improvised. The assumption was that nothing would go wrong before reaching Kure. That assumption was fatal. Shinano sailed at approximately 20 knots, fast for such a massive vessel. Her wake cut a long, pale line through the black water. Her escort scanned for submarines, fully aware that American boats were operating aggressively along the Japanese coast. Unknown to the Japanese, one of those submarines was already watching. USS Archerfish had been patrolling the area for days. Her commander, Joseph Enright, had no idea what Shinano was. He only knew that a massive contact had appeared, far larger than anything he had ever seen before. At first, Enright believed it was an oil tanker or troop transport. Then he realized something was different. The ship's size, her speed, her escorts. This was no ordinary target. As Shinano continued her voyage, small problems began to emerge. Vibrations from high speed strained unfinished joints. Minor leaks appeared in several compartments. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to worry engineers who knew how little margin for error remained. Still, the ship pressed on. Captain Abe chose not to zigzag aggressively. He feared that sharp turns might stress the hull or worsen internal leaks. This decision made Shinano's course more predictable, a subtle vulnerability that would soon become critical. Above deck, the night was calm. Below deck, tension quietly built. Shinano was finally at sea, but she was not ready for what followed. The ocean that night belonged to the submarines. Below the surface, USS Archerfish moved silently through Japanese coastal waters. She was a Balao-class submarine, fast, modern, and deadly. One of the many tools America used to choke Japan's sea lanes in the final year of the war. Her commander, Joseph Enright, had returned to duty after a painful setback earlier in the war. Now in November 1944, he was determined to prove himself. Shortly after sunset, Archerfish's radar picked up an enormous contact. At first, Enright thought it had to be an oil tanker. The size was staggering, the speed too high. Then came the escorts, destroyers maneuvering around the target with practiced precision. This was something important. As Archerfish closed the distance, the outline became clearer. A massive, unfamiliar silhouette cutting through the water. Longer than any carrier Enright had seen. Taller, heavily armored. Her deck stretched endlessly into the darkness. Enright realized he was tracking the largest warship he had ever encountered. The submarine began shadowing Shinano, staying just outside escort detection range. The Japanese destroyers were alert, but they were focused on the water ahead, not behind. Shinano's steady course made tracking easier than Enright could have hoped. Inside the submarine, the atmosphere changed instantly. This was no longer a routine patrol. Torpedo crews prepared their weapons. Fire control officers calculated angles and speeds. Every man aboard understood that this target was unique, and that failure might mean never seeing another opportunity like this again. For hours, Archerfish followed. Shinano's escorts made occasional sweeps, forcing the submarine to dive and reposition, but each time Enright regained contact. Shinano's immense wake and predictable movement betrayed her position again and again. Captain Abe remained unaware. No aircraft patrolled above. No sonar contact reported danger astern. Shinano pressed forward, believing herself protected by darkness and escorts. But darkness cuts both ways. Around midnight, Enright made his decision. He would attack. The risk was extreme. Shinano was massive. Her escorts were close. A failed approach could mean immediate destruction. But Enright understood something the Japanese did not. A ship that large could not maneuver quickly. Her size was her weakness. As Archerfish slipped into position, the submarine's crew waited in absolute silence. Only the quiet hum of electric motors and the faint ticking of instruments broke the stillness. The hunter was ready, and the giant sailed on, unaware that the moment of impact was approaching. At 3:15 a.m., the moment arrived. From his periscope, Commander Joseph Enright watched the massive silhouette fill his view. Shinano was broadside now, the perfect target. Her escorts had drifted slightly ahead, leaving a narrow window of opportunity. Enright did not hesitate. He ordered a full spread. 6 torpedoes surged from Archerfish's tubes, racing toward the largest aircraft carrier ever built. The submarine immediately turned away, diving deep to escape the inevitable counterattack. Inside Shinano, there was no warning. At 3:17 a.m., the first torpedo struck the starboard side near the bow. A violent shock ripped through the ship. Seconds later, a second torpedo detonated amidships, followed almost instantly by a third. A fourth exploded near the stern. The damage was catastrophic. Water flooded into multiple compartments simultaneously. Poorly sealed bulkheads failed almost immediately. Shock waves tore through unfinished internal structures, breaking pipes, snapping electrical cables, and rupturing fuel lines. The ship shuddered, but did not stop. At first, Shinano's crew believed the armor had saved them. The ship was still afloat. Engines continued running. Captain Abe ordered the carrier to maintain speed, hoping to outrun further attack and reach shallow waters. It was a fatal decision. By continuing at high speed, Shinano forced seawater through damaged compartments faster than damage control teams could respond. Flooding spread uncontrollably through unfinished sections of the hull. Compartments meant to be watertight filled like open wells. Inside the ship, chaos erupted. Lights failed. Communications broke down. Men struggled to understand which compartments were flooding and which were already lost. Orders conflicted. Some crews attempted counter-flooding without coordination, worsening the ship's list. Within minutes, Shinano began to lean to starboard. Damage control teams fought desperately, but many had never trained for an emergency of this scale. Valves could not be located. Doors jammed. Some compartments had no proper seals at all. The ship's immense size now worked against her. Flooding spread faster than men could run. Captain Abe finally ordered a reduction in speed, but it was too late. The list increased steadily. The carrier's stability was collapsing. Above the dark sea, Shinano's escorts circled helplessly, unaware that the greatest warship Japan ever built had already received a mortal wound. 4 torpedoes, not against armor, not against guns, but against unreadiness. The countdown had begun. Shinano did not sink quickly. She died slowly. For more than 7 hours after the torpedo hits, the largest aircraft carrier ever built remained afloat. Her engines still turned. Her escorts still circled. From a distance, she appeared wounded, but alive. Inside the ship, the reality was very different. Flooding spread relentlessly through the starboard side. Water poured through incomplete bulkheads and unsealed joints, filling compartments that were never meant to communicate with one another. Pumps were overwhelmed. Power failed in large sections of the ship, plunging passageways into darkness. Damage control teams fought a losing battle. Some attempted counter-flooding to stabilize the ship, but without coordination or proper training, their efforts made the list worse. Water shifted unpredictably inside the hull, turning Shinano into a massive, unstable weight balanced on a narrow margin of buoyancy. By dawn, the list had grown impossible to ignore. Shinano leaned more than 10 degrees to starboard. Aircraft, vehicles, and equipment, poorly secured due to the rush departure, broke free and slid across decks, smashing into bulkheads and crushing anything in their path. Men were injured not by explosions, but by the ship itself. Captain Abe ordered preparations to abandon ship. The order came too late. Launching lifeboats from a listing carrier in heavy seas was nearly impossible. Many boats could not be lowered. Others smashed against the hull or capsized immediately after touching the water. Destroyers attempted to come alongside to rescue the crew, but the angle of the ship made safe transfer difficult. Sailors jumped into the sea wearing life preservers, clinging to debris, or sliding down the hull into the water below. Some were pulled aboard escorting destroyers. Others disappeared into the dark waves. At approximately 10:18 a.m., Shinano's list exceeded 20 degrees. The ship's fate was sealed. Water flooded over the flight deck edge. Internal compartments collapsed under pressure. The carrier's massive structure groaned as steel warped and fractured under forces it was never meant to endure. Then slowly, almost gracefully, Shinano rolled. Her enormous hull turned onto its side. The flight deck vanished beneath the surface. The sea swallowed the ship piece by piece, until only her bow remained visible, pointing skyward like a monument to failure. Moments later, she was gone. The ocean closed over Japan's greatest carrier without ceremony. Of the nearly 2,400 people aboard Shinano, more than 1,400 were lost. She had never launched an aircraft, never fired her guns in battle, never fulfilled the role she was built for. Shinano had existed as an idea, a hope, a gamble, and in the end she became a warning. When Shinano disappeared beneath the waves, silence followed, not just at sea, but across Japan. The Imperial Japanese Navy immediately classified the loss as a state secret. No public announcement was made. Newspapers printed nothing. Families of the dead were told only that their sons had been lost in the line of duty, without explanation, without location, without a grave. Japan could not afford the truth. To admit that the largest aircraft carrier ever built had been sunk on her maiden voyage by a single American submarine would have been a devastating blow to morale in a nation already strained to the breaking point. So Shinano vanished twice, first beneath the ocean, then from history. Survivors were ordered to remain silent. Official records were sealed. Even within the Navy, knowledge of the disaster was tightly restricted. Many officers would not read the full story until after the war ended. For the Japanese Navy, the loss was catastrophic. Shinano represented enormous industrial effort at a time when Japan could least afford waste. Thousands of tons of steel, years of labor, critical materials diverted from other projects, and all of it gone without ever engaging the enemy. Worse still was the loss of trained personnel. Over 1,400 officers, sailors, and civilian workers died with the ship. Men Japan could not replace. Specialists, engineers, technicians, lost in a single night. In late 1944, every trained man mattered. Strategically, Shinano's sinking changed nothing, and that was the most painful truth. By the time she was lost, Japan no longer possessed the pilots, aircraft fuel, or industrial capacity to reverse the war's outcome. Even had Shinano survived, her impact would have been limited. She was a solution to a problem that had already grown beyond control. For the Americans, the victory was initially confusing. USS Archerfish's crew did not know what they had sunk. Intelligence officers debated the target's identity for weeks. Only later would analysts realize the scale of what Enright had achieved. When the truth emerged, it stunned naval planners on both sides. A single submarine had destroyed the largest aircraft carrier ever built. The symbolism was unavoidable. It marked the final collapse of Japanese naval ambition. The moment when size, armor, and tradition proved powerless against preparation, training, and timing. Shinano was not defeated by superior firepower. She was defeated by haste, by secrecy, by desperation, and by a war that no longer allowed room for unfinished ideas. Shinano was never meant to be a legend. She was meant to be a solution to shortages, to losses, to a war that Japan was no longer winning. Instead, she became a symbol. The sinking of Shinano did not change the outcome of the Pacific War. By November 1944, that outcome was already written. American industry was overwhelming. Air superiority was decisive. Japanese naval power was collapsing faster than it could be rebuilt. But Shinano mattered because of what she revealed. She revealed the danger of building weapons for yesterday's war, of trusting size instead of readiness, of believing secrecy could replace preparation. Shinano embodied the final mindset of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a belief that one great ship, one bold idea, could restore balance. That if a weapon was large enough, strong enough, impressive enough, it could compensate for lost pilots, lost fuel, lost time. It could not. Her armor was unmatched, her displacement unprecedented, her potential enormous. But potential does not float. Training floats, discipline floats, preparation floats. Shinano never had the chance to become what her designers imagined, but in a way, that is exactly the point. She represents how modern warfare punishes hesitation and rewards systems over symbols. One submarine, one commander, one opportunity. That was all it took. Today, Shinano rests on the ocean floor, unseen and unreachable. No photographs of her in service exist. No footage of her aircraft deck in operation. She survives only in documents, survivor accounts, and the lessons drawn from her loss. The largest aircraft carrier ever built, sunk without ever fighting. In that contradiction lies her legacy, not as a triumph, not as a failure of courage, but as a warning that wars are not won by ambition alone, that technology without training is fragile, that secrecy cannot compensate for readiness. Shinano did not fall because she was weak. She fell because she was unfinished. And in the end, the ocean does not care how powerful a ship was meant to be, only whether it was ready to survive.